A few more examples today of the radically hard teaching that Jesus offers to his disciples. It's the same sort of thing we were thinking about last week when we were looking at Jesus saying that he would fulfill the law, not abolish it. Fulfilling the law is precisely the kind of thing that he does today in the examples that he gives. Fulfilling meaning, as we talked about last week, interpreting the law in accordance with God's will, and abolishing meaning finding workarounds, being hypocritical, finding ways not to have to follow God's law, deliberately misinterpreting. And the result of Jesus' interpretation this week of his fulfilling the law to the disciples is that we learn that it's just about impossible to satisfy the law of God when it's fully enacted. Let's have a look at a couple of the examples. He says that anyone who calls a brother or a sister fool will be liable to the hell of fire. And the word fool there is word raka. And it's a kind of slang phrase of the time. We translate it fool, but because it's a sort of slang phrase and not terribly well attested in the literature of the period, it's a bit kind of unclear what it does mean. Maybe empty-headed, some other scholars suggest, or a bit like calling somebody stupid. And our original or first impressions might be to try and seek out what can be so terrible about this phrase, about this name calling, that warrants the same punishment as that for the murderer. But to try and find something terrible in this word is to sort of misunderstand this passage. The whole point is that it might be an everyday thing, a throwaway line that you'd say to somebody who was just irritating you. And the point that Jesus is making is to his disciples is that the same hatred is lurking within that throwaway line as is lurking within the murderer. The same hatred that causes one person to hurl an insult at another is the same hatred that causes one to commit a murder against another. It's the attitude of the heart that's the same, and it's that attitude that makes a person guilty before God, that causes sin to enter, that breaks down our relationship. Considering adultery, he says, is as much an affront to God as committing the act. And then he goes on to speak about marriage. And the passage that we heard from Matthew here adds in that extra clause, except in the case of unchastity. If you read the passage from Mark's Gospel, from which Matthew borrows it, you'll find that passage, that extra phrase isn't there. Jesus just forbids divorce outright. In fact, he goes on to say, in Moses' time, he let you divorce people because he had a soft heart. He was being generous to you, but that's not what it was intended to be. Matthew can't quite allow himself to live within that strictness. He has to find a way to soften it, to make it a little more gentle. But the point that Jesus is making is the same. If you want to live up to the fullness of the law, you will find it impossible. That idea of our intentions being as fully a breaking of the law as our actions is a bit unfamiliar to us. It's not normally the way that our legal system operates. In our legal system, we normally call the action illegal and the considering of the action nothing at all. There's a few notable exceptions, things like a conspiracy to murder that carry the same maximum penalty under English law, namely life imprisonment, as the action which you're intending carries. But this idea of our intentions creating the blockage between us and God is one that's particularly pertinent to us, and this interpretation of Jesus' understanding of the law as we celebrate 500 years since the Reformation this year. 500 years ago, towards the end of this year, admittedly, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church. And he was concerned about the nature of sin and forgiveness and how it was understood in the church and how it was taught. And he was particularly concerned about indulgences. If we were being generous, we'd say an indulgence was a way of settling up before you get to court. If we were not being generous, we'd say it's a bribe, a way of paying off time in purgatory. That was the idea, for yourself or for some family member, by contributing to the church's coffers in response and receiving in response a piece of paper with a promise on it. And Luther was deeply concerned that this misunderstood the nature of sin and forgiveness. And it got rid of, for him, the underpinning doctrine of grace. The notion and the truth that our forgiveness is only accessible through faith in God, and that nothing of our own work can break through that. But there are not some sins that are not too bad, and some sins that are really bad, some sins that you could pay off with a fiver, and some that would cost you £500, but that all sinful behaviour and all sinful intentions of the heart cut us off from God, and that nothing that we can do within our own power can reconcile us. That it's only by God's grace that our sin is forgiven and that we come into communion with him and with one another. And that's exemplified most clearly in our reception of the blessed body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ at the altar, as we'll do here this morning. And in this sacrament, we celebrate that we are united with our neighbours and that we come blameless before our God. And that insight of Luther's was right. And it's an insight that's now been recognised across the churches. And there have been amazing ecumenical projects recently where churches, including the Roman Church, have signed up to documents about the doctrine of justification by faith. But at the time, it caused a little bit of division, known as the Reformations and Counter-Reformations, a division which still persists to this day, and which was a bloody and a brutal one, with martyrs on both sides. It broke the church, and it began the splintering that we as Protestants have never really looked back from. Schism has become for us par for the course as our way of resolving, or perhaps more accurately, not resolving our differences. And yet it's precisely the kind of thing that we heard Paul speaking against in our reading this morning. Paul says, "For as long as there is jealousy and quarrelling among you, are you not of the flesh, and behaving according to human inclinations? For one says, I belong to Paul, and another, I belong to Apollos." And there are so many things you could substitute in there for the church today. I belong to St. Benedict and I follow his rule. Well, I belong to Nicky Gumbel and I follow his Alpha course. Well, I belong to a Happy Clappy church. Or, well, I belong to an Anglo-Catholic church. Or, well, I belong to an evangelical church. Well, I belong to the Methodists. Or, well, I belong to the URC. Well, I belong to the Anglican church. Or, well, I belong to the Roman church. When I was about 12 or 13, I remember being up at the sports field in Salisbury where we were playing rugby at games one afternoon. And I can't remember how it came about, but Mr. Bowman, who was a very frightening PE teacher, who also, like all PE teachers, taught geography as well. I've no idea why this is so. He was asking me about my faith, and he said, "What denomination are you?" And 13-year-old me didn't know what the word denomination meant. And I said, "Oh, well, I'm a Christian." And this sparked great laughter from him. And he said, "Oh, well, yeah. You can't just be a Christian, though. You know, what denomination are you? Are you a Baptist? Are you a Methodist? Are you Church of England?" And I said, "Well, I'm just a Christian, really." And he thought this was jolly foolish of me. But I think maybe I'll stick by my answer today, I think there was some truth that I understood then that perhaps I understand less well now. How many churches are there within a stone's throw of this building? There's a URC church, a Roman Catholic church, a Methodist church. There's our Anglican church here. There's the Life Church over there. There's the Quakers over there. There's 2 Redeemed Christian Churches of God. I was talking to Tunde, the minister who runs one of them down at the Bell Hotel. He said he'd been here for about a year, and he went to the annual leaders conference that takes place in the O2 Dome, what used to be the Millennium Dome. What's it called now? The O2 Arena, yeah. And the leader on the stage was going around and saying, give me a cheer if you're here from Colchester and Chelmsford, and if you're here from Epping. And he and his church stood up, and across the hall they saw another group of Christians stand up, and they found out that these 2 congregations had been worshipping in the same tiny little market town for the last year. And what for? Why do we have all these churches worshipping the same God, united by our faith in the same Jesus Christ? All we who proclaim him as Lord, as the way of life, all we who worship one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It seems absurd. And yet our experience and our history tells us that we have not been able to live with one another in the same church. We have had sufficient quarrels as to be unable to reconcile. And there are more quarrels ahead. Just within our own church, we will be discussing at General Synod next week on Wednesday afternoon our church's understanding of sexuality. And just as when we discussed the ordination of women, some will leave the church entirely, some will move into the Roman Church, some will set up alternative Anglican churches within the UK, and most of us will just continue disagreeing and quarrelling with one another, held together just about in the same church. And again, we come up against these situations in which we understand matters of justice, of good scriptural understanding, of the Christian life, to be quite in opposition to what other Christians understand from those exact same things. And it calls us to worry about the extent of the bonds of our unity. And we both, on both sides, strongly believe with faith and integrity that we're doing the right thing. And all that makes Jesus' words about coming to the altar very hard hearing this morning. So when you're offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. I know that I have a quarrel with my brothers and sisters, and they with me, and I know that I can't sort it out today, and I know that it's most unlikely that it's going to get sorted out during this coming week. And we're trying our hardest to walk that line between justice and unity, even when they seem poles apart. And so I come to the altar today, and I even have the arrogance to celebrate at the altar today, knowing that I am unreconciled to my Christian neighbours, and knowing that this week ahead will hold quarrels, and knowing that I am inadequate, and casting myself on the mercy of God and in full knowledge that he receives me as the jewel of his creation, forgiven, blameless, created in his image, redeemed, and loved by him beyond all else. I encourage you to do the same today, to put aside all those quarrels, all those anxieties, all the anger that you harbour towards your neighbours. And where you can't, where you know those quarrels remain unresolved, to cast yourself on the mercy of God, in the knowledge that he receives you as the jewel of his creation, that you are forgiven, blameless, created in his image, redeemed, and loved by him beyond all else.